Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast. Jessica Donovan here. I'm excited to dive into today's topic. It's a pretty complex one, but it's a really important piece of the picture to investigate if your child has iron deficiency. And that is the gut health factors that can make such a big difference to the way iron is absorbed in a particular child. And I want to cover this because although we've talked about iron deficiency on the podcast before, in a couple of episodes actually, so episode 113, I talk about iron deficiency in children broadly. So that is an episode, if you haven't listened to, you might want to listen to as well. We also explore the connection between iron deficiency, fussy eating, and constipation in episode 141. And so there will be some overlaps in terms of what we talked about there and what we talk about today. But anyone who has a child with iron deficiency or is an adult with iron deficiency really needs to know this information. And it's not commonly shared by GPs or doctors who will commonly prescribe an iron supplement when iron is low. And, you know, it's the natural, response to iron deficiency. Well, let's get more iron into this particular child if they're iron deficient. But it really is not as simple as that. And it can actually be, cause more issues. And we're going to talk about, some of these complexities in today's episode. So I think before we dive into, some of these gut factors that can impact iron absorption, it's important to understand, and let me give you a quick rundown of how iron is absorbed in the body. So really, iron absorption starts very high up in the digestive tract, in the stomach. And having adequate stomach acid is really important for the breakdown of proteins. And this breakdown of proteins really helps to, is the first, step when it comes to the absorption of iron. If foods that contain iron, the proteins that contain iron, are not broken down adequately in the stomach, then that is going to impact iron absorption, the amount of iron that we're actually absorbing from that food. So that is the first factor we really need to consider, stomach acid, and whether stomach acid levels are adequate. And there's lots of things that can impact stomach acid. Things like stress, things like really commonly prescribed reflux medications, and also things like zinc deficiency can impact and lead to low stomach acids, just to name a few things. So adequate stomach acid is really important to start that process of breaking down the food that contains iron. So then as the food moves further down the digestive tract, the absorption of iron happens in the small intestine. So once the food is in the small intestine, it needs to cross through the lining of the small intestine to get into your bloodstream. And for this to happen effectively, you need to have a healthy small intestinal environment. So if the lining of the small intestine is permeable, otherwise known as leaky gut syndrome, or there's inflammation, or there's some sort of imbalance within the small intestine, like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, for example, then the ability to absorb iron is going to be affected. And then the other thing we need to consider, this is really kind of the last step of iron absorption, is a substance called hepcidin. So hepcidin is a substance in the body that blocks iron absorption. So this is really important because too much iron in the body is dangerous. So it's really important that the body, regulates iron absorption, and too much iron isn't absorbed into the system. So as I said, hepcidin blocks the absorption of iron through the small intestine, and it is the liver that produces and sends out hepcidin in the body. And that happens when the body detects that too much iron is present. And this happens when we're taking high dose iron supplements as well. And there's research to show that rather than taking iron supplements every day, we actually get better absorption if we take them every second day. So, the approach to iron supplementation can be very different, between practitioners, or when it comes to like a medical practitioner, for example, versus a naturopath. And we often see kids that have been prescribed high dose iron supplements to take every day with a medical professional feeling like, it's kind of like the more the better. But that really is not a good approach, because of then the hepcidin increases, which blocks the absorption of iron. And so we're taking these supplements that are not being absorbed. And to make things worse, a lot of the supplements that are recommended by GPs are not very easily absorbable forms of iron. So, we really want to get support from someone who really understands nutrition and the gut, as opposed to let's just get some iron in and get as high a dose as possible into the system. Because, the catch-22 of all of this is that when we are taking too much iron, it can increase inflammation, and inflammation can then increase hepcidin and block iron absorption. And also the forms of iron, as I said, that are often prescribed can lead to things like constipation, which can lead to gut inflammation. So it's really ends up, not getting anywhere. And I imagine that there's some people listening to this going, yes, my child's been taking iron supplements for so long and their iron is just not, increasing. So we really need to be looking at the absorbability in the gut, and making sure that if we are giving our kids supplements, they're easily absorbable forms of iron, and that, like I said, taking every second day can be more effective for a lot of people than taking every day. So it's not the more the better. We really need to look holistically at the whole picture. So to recap, when it comes to gut factors that are going to affect the absorbability of the iron that we are getting from food or supplements, it really comes down to stomach acid, having healthy stomach acid, having a healthy environment within the small intestine. So things like leaky gut, or any sort of imbalance in bacteria, intestinal permeability, which is really another name for leaky gut, are all going to impact that absorption of iron. And then there is inflammation. So inflammation broadly is going to affect iron absorption, and specifically any inflammation within the gut. So we know that anyone that has an inflammatory bowel disease or disorder, such as Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, have a much higher chance of developing iron deficiency. But when we look at gut inflammation on a sort of smaller scale, when we're thinking about tummy pain and food intolerances and constipation, and even things like parasites can cause inflammation within the gut, and these things are going to impact the absorption of iron. So as you can hear, there is so much more to improving iron levels in a child or an adult, this is really transferable to adults as well, than just getting more and more iron in. I think I've made that pretty clear. So we want to be making sure we're addressing and looking at these factors in any child that has been diagnosed or, low iron has come up on blood tests, which we know is really common. It's not just about increasing iron through food or through supplements. Now, a couple of other things I want to mention here. Celiac disease. We've talked about celiac disease over the last couple of weeks on the podcast. So if you're interested to learn more about celiac disease, you can go and listen to the last couple of episodes before this one. Whenever celiac disease has been picked up in someone, it's a really good idea to get iron levels checked, and vice versa. If there's iron deficiency that is not improving, then it's really important to look at, flagging celiac disease. Celiac disease could potentially be a problem. And I won't go into too much about celiac disease, but basically, there's a lot of damage done to the small intestine in celiac disease. So that absorbability of the iron is compromised. The other thing I want to mention is, the different forms of iron that we can get through food. So when we're relying on plant-based sources of iron, we are primarily going to be getting non-heme iron. And this kind of complicates things even more because that non-heme iron has to go through another step to change the form before it can be absorbed in the small intestine as well. So animal protein forms of iron, such as red meat, for example, are much easier to absorb than non-heme forms of iron found in plant foods. And this is, one of the reasons that iron deficiency is much more common in people that follow a vegetarian or a vegan diet. So this is a really important consideration, especially for children that are in, big growth phases, or teenage girls that are starting to menstruate and are losing blood every month. We really want to be making sure we're optimizing that intake of iron, particularly if they're not eating a lot of red meat, or they're fussy with red meat, or, as I said, they're following a vegetarian or vegan diet. Okay, so I hope I'm not making it sound like an impossible feat to get a child's iron levels corrected if they do have deficiency. But, really the point that I'm trying to make is it's not just about getting more and more iron in, it's about optimizing the absorption of iron. And a big part of that is making sure that we're correcting and getting support for any sort of digestive symptoms that our children have. We find here at Natural Super Kids that most kids with iron deficiency, like the vast majority of kids with iron deficiency, have some sort of gut symptoms, whether it is regular sort of tummy pain, whether it's constipation, whether it's food intolerances, and these things need to be looked at and corrected. And, most importantly, the underlying, causes of these gut symptoms need to be looked at to get long-term results in terms of improving iron levels. So now the positive news. If we do want to look at iron supplements, and also some other supplements that can potentially help with the absorption of iron, there's a couple of recommendations that I have. So first of all, the form of iron in supplements is really important. And the top pick for me is an iron bisglycinate. So this is a very easily absorbable form of iron. And again, we don't need huge doses. So if our kids are iron deficient and we're comparing a couple of supplements, one might be a bisglycinate that only has 5 milligrams of iron, and then we might have another form of iron in a more pharmaceutical sort of brand of iron that is much higher, maybe 20, 30 milligrams. Common sense goes, okay, let's go with the higher dose one. But I hope I've made it clear in this episode that that is not, the best course. So we don't need loads at like really high doses. Absorbability, the form of iron and being highly absorbable is much more important. And for that, I would generally recommend an iron bisglycinate, which you can find in a variety of supplements. And then there is some research to suggest that certain probiotic species and strains can really increase the absorption of iron quite significantly. So there's one particular strain called Lactobacillus plantarum 299V, which has been shown to increase absorption of iron by up to 50%. So that is huge. So if we can add in some probiotic strains that are going to increase absorption, as well as a really easily absorbable form of iron, and potentially looking at taking it every second day, we can get much better results when it comes to our children's iron deficiency. And of course, as I said, we really want to be addressing any gut symptoms that they have. Microbiome testing can be really helpful for kids with iron deficiency. It's not always warranted, and it is a bit of a financial investment, but you get a really good picture as to what is going on in the gut microbiome, and some really important information in terms of factors that could be inhibiting iron absorption in a particular child. So that can be a really helpful, test to look at. We can certainly organise that for you here at Natural Super Kids. And the first step is to book an appointment with one of our practitioners. We did a couple of episodes on microbiome testing fairly recently. I'll make sure those links to those episodes are in the show notes as well. So I think I've made my point. If your child has iron deficiency issues, particularly if they're long-standing, please make sure that you are looking at the gut factors that we've talked about in today's episode. Now, we do have a really handy kids gut health ebook for you. It's completely free. It's not specific for these factors of iron absorption, but it's got lots of really good practical tips on how to improve gut health and gut microbiome health in children, and anything that we can do that is going to positively influence our children's gut health and their microbiome health is always going to be a good thing when it comes to the absorbability of iron. So I'll pop the link to that free ebook in the show notes. It's a really popular free download that we have. We get lots of really great feedback about it, and it really breaks down the steps that we think are important when it comes to optimizing your children's gut health. So I hope you enjoy that. And as I said, the link to that is in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me and listening in to today's episode. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or you've got any questions, please reach out to us. One of the best ways to do that is just DM us on Instagram. You'll find us at Natural Super Kids on Instagram, and we always share lots of complimentary information to our podcast episodes over on Instagram, so you can learn more from us over there. Thanks so much. See you next week. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.